So I wanted to take a minute and introduce this week's discussion topic, which is body image and addiction. There's an awful lot of lying going on and a lot of distorted self-perception. So this is regarding adolescents and high school students in Australia, but your body image is made up of your thoughts and feelings that result from how you perceive your physical self. It can be either positive or negative. And poor body image can lead to depression, anxiety, alcohol, and other drug use, and eating disorders. Some warning signs that you or someone you know might have a body image issue are, of course, distorted eating habits, obsession with weight or exercise or even appearance, and being continually self-critical and constantly comparing body size. So women by far are under more pressure to conform to a highly unrealistic ideal for figure and proportion. Most high school girls in Australia wish that they were thinner, and body image is their number one concern. Of Australian high school girls, 3/4 of them wish they were thinner, half of them have tried to lose weight, and 16% are actually happy with their body weight. Guys have body image issues too. A third of males want to be thinner, and another third want to be bulkier. More than 1 in 5 young men says body image is their number one concern. And they provided some tips for a better body image, saying something positive about your body every day, aiming to get healthier rather than lose weight, focus on yourself as a person and not just how you look, and stop making unkind comments about other bodies, and choose media that makes you feel better and not worse. And the UK started a Be Body Kind campaign because they noticed in 2019 that there was a epidemic of negative body image. 1 in 5 UK adults said images on social media had caused them to worry about their body image. 1 in 8 have experienced suicidal thoughts or feelings because of concerns about their body image. And 1 in 3 have felt anxious or depressed because of concerns about their body image. And finally, 1 in 5 UK adults have felt shame because of their body image in the last year. 1 in 5. Man, 20%. So, of course, shame is different than guilt. Guilt is a failure of doing. Shame is a failure of being. And there's fewer, more potent negative emotions than shame. And it's a extremely painful form of self-loathing. It's also a risk factor for initiating drug use, binge drinking, comfort eating, leading to, of course, eating disorders, exercise addiction, or paradoxically recoiling from going to gyms because of body anxiety, self-harm, and suicide. Shame often drives escalating drug use, and anchors people in addiction, often in a vicious cycle of drug binge, remorse, and shame, more shame that is, and needing to numb and then repeat this cycle. And if not addressed in recovery, shame frequently drives relapse. So for those reasons, I wanted to get into body image and shame regarding the treatment of addicts, because body image is one of the number one ways that girls end up experiencing shame. And it's also becoming a increasingly more prevalent cause of shame for young men as well.
Stronger, smaller, lighter, fuller, tighter, thinner, softer. It really works.
So I'll start with this. A couple of years ago, an event planner called me because I was going to do a speaking event, and she called and she said, I'm really struggling with how to write about you on the little flyer. And I thought, well, what's the struggle? And she said, well, I saw you speak, and I'm going to call you a researcher, I think, but I'm afraid if I call you a researcher, no one will come because they'll think you're boring and irrelevant. And I was like, okay. And she said, but the thing I liked about your talk is, you're a storyteller, so I think what I'll do is just call you a storyteller. And of course, the academic, insecure part of me was like, you're going to call me a what? And she said, I'm going to call you a storyteller. And I was like, oh, why not Magic Pixie? I was like, let me think about this for a second. And so I tried to call deep on my courage. And I thought, I am a storyteller. I'm a qualitative researcher. I collect stories. That's what I do. And maybe stories are just data with a soul, and maybe I'm just a storyteller. So I said, you know what? Why don't you just say I'm a researcher storyteller? And she went, there's no such thing. So I'm a researcher storyteller. And I'm going to talk to you today. We're talking about expanding perception. And so I want to talk to you and tell some stories about a piece of my research that fundamentally expanded my perception and really actually changed the way that I live and love and work and parent. And this is where my story starts. When I was a young researcher, doctoral student, my first year I had a research professor who said to us, here's the thing, if you cannot measure it, it does not exist. And I thought he was just sweet talking me. I was like, really? And he's like, absolutely. So you have to understand that I have a bachelor's in social work, a master's in social work, and I was getting my PhD in social work. So my entire academic career was surrounded by people who kind of believed in the life's messy, love it, and I'm more the life's messy, clean it up, organize it, and put it into a bento box. And so to think that I had found my way, to found a career that takes me, really one of the big sayings in social work is lean into the discomfort of the work. And I'm like, knock discomfort upside the head and move it over and get all A's. That was my mantra. So I was very excited about this. And so I thought, you know what? This is the career for me because I am interested in some messy topics, but I want to be able to make them not messy. I want to understand them. I want to hack into these things that I know are important and lay the code out for everyone to see. So where I started was with connection, because by the time you're a social worker for 10 years, what you realize is that connection is why we're here. It's what gives purpose and meaning to our lives. This is what it's all about. It doesn't matter whether you talk to people who work in social justice and mental health and abuse and neglect. What we know is that connection, the ability to feel connected, is neurobiologically, that's how we're wired, it's why we're here. So I thought, you know what, I'm going to start with connection. Well, you know that situation where you get an evaluation from your boss and she tells you 37 things that you do really awesome and one thing that you can't, an opportunity for growth. And all you can think about is that opportunity for growth, right? Well, apparently this is the way my work went as well, because when you ask people about love, they tell you about heartbreak. When you ask people about belonging, they'll tell you their most excruciating experiences of being excluded. And when you ask people about connection, the stories they told me were about disconnection. So very quickly, really about 6 weeks into this research, I ran into this unnamed thing that absolutely unraveled connection in a way that I didn't understand or had never seen. And so I pulled back out of the research and thought, I need to figure out what this is. And it turned out to be shame. And shame is really easily understood as the fear of disconnection. Is there something about me that if other people know it or see it, that I won't be worthy of connection? The things I can tell you about it, it's universal. We all have it. The only people who don't experience shame have no capacity for human empathy or connection. No one wants to talk about it, and the less you talk about it, the more you have it. What underpinned this shame, this I'm not good enough, which we all know that feeling, I'm not blank enough, I'm not thin enough, rich enough, beautiful enough, smart enough, promoted enough. The thing that underpinned this was excruciating vulnerability. This idea of, in order for connection to happen, we have to allow ourselves to be seen, really seen. And you know how I feel about vulnerability. I hate vulnerability. And so I thought, this is my chance to beat it back with my measuring stick. I'm going in, I'm gonna figure this stuff out, I'm gonna spend a year, I'm gonna totally deconstruct shame, I'm gonna understand how vulnerability works, and I'm gonna outsmart it. So I was ready, and I was really excited. As you know, it's not gonna turn out well. You know this. So I could tell you a lot about shame, but I'd have to borrow everyone else's time. But here's what I can tell you that it boils down to. And this may be one of the most important things that I've ever learned in the decade of doing this research. My 1 year turned into 6 years, thousands of stories, hundreds of long interviews, focus groups. At one point, people were sending me journal pages and sending me their stories, thousands of pieces of data, and 6 years. And I kind of got a handle on it. I kind of understood this is what shame is, this is how it works. I wrote a book, I published a theory, but something was not okay. And what it was is that if I roughly took the people I interviewed and divided them into people who really have a sense of worthiness, that's what this comes down to, a sense of worthiness. They have a strong sense of love and belonging. And folks who struggle for it, and folks who are always wondering if they're good enough. There was only one variable that separated the people who have a strong sense of love and belonging and the people who really struggle for it, and that was the people who have a strong sense of love and belonging believe they're worthy of love and belonging. That's it. They believe they're worthy. And to me, the hard part of the one thing that keeps us out of connection is our fear that we're not worthy of connection, was something that personally and professionally I felt like I needed to understand better. So what I did is I took all of the interviews where I saw worthiness, where I saw people living that way, and just looked at those. What do these people have in common? And I have a slight office supply addiction, but that's another talk. So I had a manila notebook, a manila folder, and I had a Sharpie, and I was like, what am I gonna call this research? And the first words that came to my mind were wholehearted. These are kind of wholehearted people living from this deep sense of worthiness. So I wrote at the top of the manila folder, and I started looking at the data. In fact, I did it first in this in a 4-day, very intensive data analysis where I went back, pulled these interviews, pulled the stories, pulled the incidents. What's the theme? What's the pattern? My husband left town with the kids because I always go into this kind of Jackson Pollock crazy thing where I'm just like writing and going and kind of just in my researcher mode. And so here's what I found. What they had in common was a sense of courage. And I want to separate courage and bravery for you for a minute. Courage, the original definition of courage, when it first came into the English language, it's from the Latin word cur, meaning heart, and the original definition was to tell the story of who you are with your whole heart. And so these folks had, very simply, the courage to be imperfect. They had the compassion to be kind to themselves first and then to others, because as it turns out, we can't practice compassion with other people if we can't treat ourselves kindly. And the last was they had connection, and this was the hard part, as a result of authenticity. They were willing to let go of who they thought they should be in order to be who they were, which is, you have to absolutely do that for connection. The other thing that they had in common was this. They fully embraced vulnerability. They believed that what made them vulnerable made them beautiful. They didn't talk about vulnerability being comfortable, nor did they really talk about it being excruciating, as I had heard earlier in the shame interviewing. They just talked about it being necessary. They talked about the willingness to say, I love you first. The willingness to do something where there are no guarantees. The willingness to breathe through waiting for the doctor to call after your mammogram. The willing to invest in a relationship that may or may not work out. They thought this was fundamental. I personally thought it was betrayal. I could not believe I had pledged allegiance to research, where our job, the definition of research is to control and predict, to study phenomenon for the explicit reason to control and predict. And now my mission to control and predict had turned up the answer that the way to live is with vulnerability and to stop controlling and predicting. This led to a little breakdown, which actually looked more like this. And it did. It led to I call it a breakdown, my therapist calls it a spiritual awakening. Spiritual awakening sounds better than breakdown, but I assure you it was a breakdown. And I had to put my data away and go find a therapist. Let me tell you something. You know who you are when you call your friends and say, I think I need to see somebody. Do you have any recommendations? Because about 5 of my friends were like, woo, I wouldn't want to be your therapist. And I was like, what does that mean? And they're like, oh, I'm just saying, like, don't bring your measuring stick. I was like, okay. So I found a therapist. My first meeting with her, Diana, I brought in my list of the way the wholehearted live. And I sat down, and she said, how are you? And I said, I'm great, I'm okay. And she said, what's going on? And I said, and this is a therapist who sees therapists, because we have to go to those because their BS meters are good. And so I said, here's the thing, I'm struggling. And she said, what's the struggle? And I said, well, I have a vulnerability issue, and I know that vulnerability is kind of the core of shame and fear and our struggle for worthiness, but it appears that it's also the birthplace of joy, of creativity, of belonging, of love, and I think I have a problem, and I need some help. And I said, but here's the thing, no family stuff, no childhood shit, I just need some strategies. Thank you. So she goes like this. And then I said, it's bad, right? And she said, it's neither good nor bad. It just is what it is. And I said, oh my God, this is gonna suck. And it did, and it didn't. And it took about a year. And you know how there are people that, like, when they realize that vulnerability and tenderness are important, that they kind of surrender and walk into it? A, that's not me. And B, I don't even hang out with people like that. For me, it was a year-long street fight. It was a slugfest. Vulnerability pushed, I pushed back. I lost the fight, but probably won my life back. And so then I went back into the research and spent the next couple of years really trying to understand what they, the wholehearted, what the choices they were making, and what are we doing with vulnerability? Why do we struggle with it so much? Am I alone in struggling with vulnerability? No. So this is what I learned. We numb vulnerability. When we're waiting for the call, it was funny, I sent something out on Twitter and on Facebook that says, how would you define vulnerability? What makes you feel vulnerable? And within an hour and a half, I had 150 responses. Because I wanted to know, what's out there. Having to ask my husband for help because I'm sick and we're newly married. Initiating sex with my husband, initiating sex with my wife. Being turned down, asking someone out. Waiting for the doctor to call back. Getting laid off, laying off people. This is the world we live in. We live in a vulnerable world. And one of the ways we deal with it is we numb vulnerability. And I think there's evidence, and it's not the only reason this evidence exists, but I think that it's a huge cause. We are the most in debt, obese, addicted, and medicated adult cohort in US history.
That's a really strong statement to make, but it's definitely worth repeating because it's even more true today than it was in 2010 when she made it.
We are the most in debt, obese, addicted, and medicated adult cohort in US history. The problem is, and I learned this from the research, that you cannot selectively numb emotion. You can't say, here's the bad stuff. Here's vulnerability, here's grief, here's shame, here's fear, here's disappointment. I don't want to feel these. I'm going to have a couple of beers and a banana nut muffin. I don't want to feel these. And I know that's knowing laughter. I hack into your lives for a living. I know that's, God. You can't numb those hard feelings without numbing the other affects or emotions. You cannot selectively numb. So when we numb those, we numb joy. We numb gratitude. We numb happiness. And then we are miserable and we are looking for purpose and meaning. And then we feel vulnerable. So then we have a couple of beers and a banana nut muffin. And it becomes this dangerous cycle. One of the things that I think that we need to think about is why and how we numb. And it doesn't just have to be addiction. The other thing we do is we make everything that's uncertain certain. Religion has gone from a belief in faith and mystery to certainty. I'm right, you're wrong, shut up. That's it. Just certain. The more afraid we are, the more vulnerable we are, the more afraid we are. This is what politics looks like today. There's no discourse anymore. There's no conversation. There's just blame. You know how blame is described in the research? A way to discharge pain and discomfort. We perfect. If there's anyone who wants their life to look like this, it would be me. But it doesn't work, because what we do is we take fat from our butts and put it in our cheeks. Which just, I hope in 100 years people will look back and go, wow. You know? And we perfect, most dangerously, our children. Let me tell you what we think about children. They're hardwired for struggle when they get here. When you hold those perfect little babies in your hand, our job is not to say, look at her, she's perfect. My job is just to keep her perfect, make sure she makes the tennis team by 5th grade and Yale by 7th grade. That's not our job. Our job is to look and say, you know what? You're imperfect and you're wired for struggle, but you are worthy of love and belonging. That's our job. Show me a generation of kids raised like that, and we'll end the problems I think that we see today. We pretend that what we do doesn't have an effect on people. We do that in our personal lives. We do that corporate, whether it's a bailout, an oil spill, a recall. We pretend like what we're doing doesn't have a huge impact on other people. I would say to companies, this is not our first rodeo, people. We just need you to be authentic and real and say, we're sorry, we'll fix it. But there's another way, and I'll leave you with this. This is what I have found: to let ourselves be seen, deeply seen, vulnerably seen. To love with our whole hearts, even though there's no guarantee. And that's really hard. And I can tell you as a parent, that's excruciatingly difficult. To practice gratitude and joy in those moments of kind of terror when we're wondering, can I love you this much? Can I believe in this as passionately? Can I be this fierce about this? Just to be able to stop and instead of catastrophizing what might happen, to say, I'm just so grateful because to feel this vulnerable means I'm alive. And the last, which I think is probably the most important, is to believe that we're enough. Because when we work from a place, I believe, that says, I'm enough, then we stop screaming and start listening. We're kinder and gentler to the people around us, and we're kinder and gentler to ourselves. That's all I have. I'm going to tell you a little bit about my TEDx Houston talk. I woke up the morning after I gave that talk with the worst vulnerability hangover of my life. And I actually didn't leave my house for about 3 days. The first time I left was to meet a friend for lunch. And when I walked in, she was already at the table, and I sat down, and she said, God, you look like hell. I said, thanks. I feel really, I'm not functioning. And she said, what's going on? And I said, I just told 500 people that I became a researcher to avoid vulnerability, and that when being vulnerable emerged from my data as absolutely essential to wholehearted living, I told these 500 people that I had a breakdown. I had a slide that said breakdown. At what point did I think that was a good idea? And she said, I saw your talk live streamed. It was not really you. It was a little different than what you usually do, but it was great. And I said, this can't happen. YouTube, they're putting this thing on YouTube, and we're going to be talking about 600, 700 people. And she said, well, I think it's too late. And I said, let me ask you something. And she said, yeah. And I said, do you remember when we were in college and really wild and kind of dumb? She said, yeah. And I said, remember when we leave a really bad message on our ex-boyfriend's answering machine? Then we'd have to break into his dorm room and then erase the tape. And she goes, no. So, of course, the only thing I could think of to say at that point was, yeah, me neither. Yeah, me neither. And I'm thinking to myself, Renee, what are you doing? What are you doing? Why did you bring this up? Have you lost your mind? Your sisters would be perfect for this. So I looked back up and she said, are you really going to try to break in and steal the video before they put it on YouTube? And I said, I'm just thinking about it a little bit. She said, you're like the worst vulnerability role model ever. And then I looked at her and I said something that at the time felt a little dramatic, but ended up being more prophetic than dramatic. I said, if 500 turns into 1,000 or 2,000, my life is over. I had no contingency plan for 4 million.
How about a contingency for over 65 million views? And that's how many times it's been viewed since it was initially posted in June of 2010.
And my life did end when that happened. And maybe the hardest part about my life ending is that I learned something hard about myself, and that was that as much as I would be frustrated about not being able to get my work out to the world, there was a part of me that was working very hard to engineer staying small, staying right under the radar. But I want to talk about what I've learned. There's two things that I've learned in the last year. The first is vulnerability is not weakness. And that myth is profoundly dangerous. Let me ask you honestly, and I'll give you this warning. I'm trained as a therapist, so I can outweight you uncomfortably. So if you could just raise your hand, that would be awesome. How many of you, honestly, when you're thinking about doing something vulnerable or saying something vulnerable, think, God, vulnerability is weakness, this is weakness? How many of you think of vulnerability and weakness synonymously? The majority of people. Now let me ask you this question. This past week at TED, how many of you, when you saw vulnerability up here, thought it was pure courage? Vulnerability is not weakness. I define vulnerability as emotional risk, exposure, uncertainty. It fuels our daily lives. And I've come to the belief, this is my 12th year doing this research, that vulnerability is our most accurate measurement of courage. To be vulnerable, to let ourselves be seen, to be honest. One of the weird things that's happened is after the TED explosion, I got a lot of offers to speak all over the country. Everyone from schools and parent meetings to Fortune 500 companies. And so many of the calls went like this. Hey, Dr. Brown, we loved your TED Talk. We'd like you to come in and speak. We'd appreciate it if you wouldn't mention vulnerability or shame. What would you like for me to talk about? There's three big answers. This is mostly, to be honest with you, from the business sector. Innovation, creativity, and change. So let me go on the record and say, vulnerability is the birthplace of innovation, creativity, and change. To create is to make something that has never existed before. There's nothing more vulnerable than that. Adaptability to change is all about vulnerability. The second thing, in addition to really finally understanding the relationship between vulnerability and courage, the second thing I learned is this. We have to talk about shame. And I'm going to be really honest with you. When I became like a vulnerability researcher, and that became the focus because of the TED Talk, and I'm not kidding that. I'll give you an example. About 3 months ago, I was in a sporting goods store buying goggles and shin guards and all the things that parents buy at the sporting goods store. About from 100 feet away, this is what I hear. Vulnerability TED, vulnerability TED. Yeah, I'm a fifth-generation Texan. Our family motto is lock and load. I am not a natural vulnerability researcher. So I'm like, just keep walking, she's on my six. And then I hear, vulnerability TED. I turn around and I go, hi. She's right here. And she said, you're the shame researcher who had the breakdown. At this point, parents are like pulling their children close to like, look away. And I'm so worn out at this point in my life. I look at her and I actually say, it was a frickin' spiritual awakening. And she looks back and does this. I know. And she said, we watched your TED Talk in my book club, then we read your book, and we renamed ourselves the Breakdown Babes. And she said, our tagline is, we're falling apart and it feels fantastic. You can only imagine what it's like for me in a faculty meeting. So when I became Vulnerability TED, like an action figure, like Ninja Barbie, but I'm Vulnerability TED, I thought I'm going to leave that shame stuff behind because I spent 6 years studying shame before I really started writing and talking about vulnerability. And I thought, thank God, because shame is this horrible topic. No one wants to talk about it. It's the best way to shut people down on an airplane. What do? I study shame. Oh. And I see you. You know. But in surviving this last year, I was reminded of a cardinal rule, not a research rule, but a moral imperative from my upbringing. You gotta dance with the one who brung you. And I did not learn about vulnerability and courage and creativity and innovation from studying vulnerability. I learned about these things from studying shame. And so I want to walk you in to shame. Jungian analysts call shame the swampland of the soul. And we're going to walk in, and the purpose is not to walk in and, construct a home and live there. It is to put on some galoshes and walk through and find our way around. Here's why. We heard the most compelling call ever to have a conversation in this country, and I think globally, around race, right? Yes, we heard that. Yes? Cannot have that conversation without shame. Because you cannot talk about race without talking about privilege, and when people start talking about privilege, they get paralyzed by shame. We heard a brilliant, simple solution to not killing people in surgery, which is have a checklist. You can't fix that problem without addressing shame, because when they teach those folks how to suture, they also teach them how to stitch their self-worth to being all-powerful. And all-powerful folks don't need checklists. And I had to write down the name of this TED Fellow so I didn't mess it up here. Mishkin Ingawale. I hope I did right by you. I saw the TED Fellows my first day here, and he got up and he explained how he was driven to create some technology to help test for anemia because people were dying unnecessarily. And he said, I saw this need, so you know what I did? I made it. And everybody just burst into applause, and they were like, yes! And he said, and it didn't work. And then I made it 32 more times. And then it worked. You know what the big secret about TED is? I can't wait to tell people this. I guess I'm doing it right now. This is like the failure conference. No, it is. You know why this place is amazing? Because very few people here are afraid to fail. And no one that gets on the stage so far that I've seen has not failed. I have failed miserably, many times. I don't think the world understands that because of shame. There's a great quote that saved me this past year by Theodore Roosevelt. A lot of people refer to it as a man in the arena quote. And it goes like this: it is not the critic who counts. It is not the man who sits and points out how the doer of deeds could have done things better and how he falls and stumbles. The credit goes to the man in the arena, whose face is marred with dust and blood and sweat. But when he's in the arena, at best, he wins, and at worst, he loses. But when he fails, when he loses, he does so daring greatly. And that's what this conference to me is about. That's what life is about daring greatly, about being in the arena. When you walk up to that arena and you put your hand on the door and you think, I'm going in and I'm going to try this, shame is the gremlin who says, you're not good enough. You never finished that MBA. Your wife left you. I know your dad really wasn't in Luxembourg, he was in Sing Sing. I know those things that happened to you growing up. I know you don't think that you're pretty enough or smart enough or talented enough or powerful enough. I know your dad never paid attention even when you made CFO. Shame is that thing. And then if we can quiet it down and walk in and say, I'm going to do this, we look up and the critic that we see pointing and laughing 99% of the time is who? Us. Shame drives two big tapes: never good enough, and if you can talk it out of that one, who do you think you are? The thing to understand about shame is it's not guilt. Shame is a focus on self. Guilt is a focus on behavior. Shame is I am bad. Guilt is I did something bad. How many of you, if you did something that was hurtful to me, would be willing to say, I'm sorry, I made a mistake? How many of you would be willing to say that? Guilt, I'm sorry, I made a mistake. Shame, I'm sorry, I am a mistake. There is a huge difference between shame and guilt. And here's what you need to know. Shame is highly, highly correlated with addiction, depression, violence, aggression, bullying, suicide, eating disorders. And here's what you even need to know more. Guilt, inversely correlated with those things. The ability to hold something we've done or failed to do up against who we want to be is incredibly adaptive. It's uncomfortable, but it's adaptive. The other thing you need to know about shame is it's absolutely organized by gender. If shame washes over me and washes over Chris, it's going to feel the same. Everyone sitting in here knows the warm wash of shame. We're pretty sure that the only people who don't experience shame are people who have no capacity for connection or empathy. Which means, yes, I have a little shame, no, I'm a sociopath. So I would opt for yes, you have a little shame. Shame feels the same for men and women, but it's organized by gender. For women, the best example I can give you is Anjali, the commercial. I can put the wash on the line, pack the lunches, hand out the kisses, and be work at 5 to 9. I can bring home the bacon fried up in the pan and never let you forget you're a man. For women, shame is do it all, do it perfectly, and never let them see you sweat. I don't know how much perfume that commercial sold, but I guarantee you it moved a lot of antidepressants and anti-anxiety meds. Shame for women is this web of unattainable, conflicting, competing expectations about who we're supposed to be. And it's a straitjacket. For men, shame is not a bunch of competing, conflicting expectations. Shame is one. Do not be perceived as what? Weak. I did not interview men for the first 4 years of my study, and it wasn't until a man looked at me one day after a book signing and said, "I love what you have to say about shame. I'm curious why you didn't mention men." And I said, "I don't study men." And he said, "That's convenient." And I said, "Why?" And he said, "Because you say to reach out, tell our story, be vulnerable. But you see those books you just signed for my wife and my 3 daughters?" I said, "Yeah. They'd rather me die on top of my white horse than watch me fall down." When we reach out and be vulnerable, we get the shit beat out of us. And don't tell me it's from the guys and the coaches and the dads. Because the women in my life are harder on me than anyone else. So I started interviewing men and asking questions. And what I learned is this. You show me a woman who can actually sit with a man in real vulnerability and fear, I'll show you a woman who's done incredible work. You show me a man who can sit with a woman who's just had it. She can't do it all anymore. And his first response is not, "I unloaded the dishwasher." But he really listens, because that's all we need. I'll show you a guy who's done a lot of work. Shame is an epidemic in our culture. And to get out from underneath it, to find our way back to each other, we have to understand how it affects us and how it affects the way we're parenting, the way we're working, the way we're looking at each other. Very quickly, some research by Mahalik at Boston College. He asked, what do women need to do to conform to female norms? The top answers in this country: nice, thin, modest, and use all available resources for appearance. When he asked about men, what do men in this country need to do to conform with male norms? The answers were always show emotional control, work is first, pursue status, and violence. If we're going to find our way back to each other, we have to understand and know empathy, because empathy is the antidote to shame. If you put shame in a petri dish, it needs 3 things to grow exponentially: secrecy, silence, and judgment. If you put the same amount of shame in a petri dish and douse it with empathy, it can't survive. The 2 most powerful words when we're in struggle: me too. And so I'll leave you with this thought. If we're going to find our way back to each other, vulnerability is going to be that path. And I know it's seductive to stand outside the arena, because I think I did it my whole life, and think to myself, I'm going to go in there and kick some ass when I'm bulletproof and when I'm perfect. And that is seductive. But the truth is, that never happens. And even if you got as perfect as you could and as bulletproof as you could possibly muster, when you got in there, that's not what we want to see. We want you to go in. We want to be with you and across from you. And we just want for ourselves and for the people we care about and the people we work with to dare greatly. So thank y'all very much. I really appreciate it.
Okay, so when I talk to people right now since the pandemic, since COVID-19, and I say, how are you doing? And they describe how they're doing, I hear grief.
Yes.
But when I come back and say, God, yeah, there's a lot of grief. No, I'm not in grief. There's no grief here.
Right. Right.
Tell me about what you see us experiencing right now.
We are all dealing with the collective loss of the world we knew.
Oh,
The
God.
world we knew is now gone forever. We talk about 9/11. Do you remember what the airports were like before 9/11?
Yeah.
We're going to talk about, do you remember what the world was like before the pandemic? I don't know how this is going to change, but it will. We're going to find meaning. We're going to come out the other side of this. And we're going to say things like, do you remember in the old days when we used to shake hands? How crazy was that? Or whatever it is. But this world that we've all been accustomed to is now gone. And we're collectively, just like you said, so many people are feeling heaviness. So many people are talking about, I woke up and cried. I went to bed and cried. And just like you, I'm like, it's grief. And yet there's a part of us that goes, grief, no one died yet. And we don't understand. When people say to me, what is grief? I'll say it's the death of something. It's the death of a loved one. It's the death of a marriage. It's called a divorce. It's the death of a relationship. It's called a breakup. A job loss is the loss of that work world you had. This is a collective loss of the world we all lived in before the pandemic. And we, like every other loss, didn't know what we had until it was gone. And so here we are. And just like you, we're all trying to find ways to virtually hold each other's hands. We're in this together. It is not going to be forever. It will end. There's not a dark night that stays. And yet, we have to feel these feelings. We've got to feel the grief.
If you look in the mirror and feel disappointed, you're not alone. An international survey found that 56% of women and 43% of men are dissatisfied with their overall appearance. So why is it so hard to like your own body, and how can you use your own psychology and neurology to help? Neurologically, the concept of your body is made up of many different parts. The visual image of yourself from your eyes, the feeling of your body even when you can't see it, called proprioception, or even a somatotopic arrangement or brain map in your head that has sections devoted to processing sensations and commands to specific body parts. But this internal or individualistic view of your body is also complemented by a collectivist view, which is how you think your body should exist based on your social groups and other external factors. One major component is self-objectification, which is when you compare your body to a collective other based on the types of bodies you see around you. And in the age of social media, we've been dealt a tough hand when it comes to handling our own body dissatisfaction. A 2017 study looking at 3,000 different female models from 20 different modeling agencies calculated that the average BMI among them was 17.3, which is far below the average American woman's BMI of 26.5. Another study showed men advertisements with male models versus ones with just household products, and the men who viewed the male models immediately felt less body satisfaction compared to those looking at household objects. We actually begin thinking about the size and shape of our bodies in relation to our peers very early in life. Studies show that around 3 out of 5 children between the ages of 8 to 11 years old want their bodies to be different in some way, and by the age of 16, only 16.6% of boys and just 12% of girls were at their desired body size. This disconnect in our brain comes partly from a phenomenon called visual adaptation. The more you see or hear anything, your sensitivity and perception to that stimulus changes. Our constant exposure to perfectly engineered faces and bodies tunes our minds to perceive them as normal and ourselves as the outliers. This was shown plainly in a 2017 study where subjects were presented with images of a low-mass body and then subsequent images of average bodies. The subjects tended to describe the average images as much larger than they actually were. But even more fundamental is our basic human need to fit in and belong. One of our greatest achievements as Homo sapiens has been to organize in large groups and communities. But the prospect of not fitting in or being rejected would have not only meant no sexual reproduction, but potentially death or danger, which is why we've evolved such strong social mechanisms to keep our relationships intact, like our sensitivity to group conformity and feedback from others. So what can we do now in the 21st century? First, being around people who actually love and accept you will allow you to build a solid base for your self-confidence and belonging. But honestly, the most tangible step you can take to mitigate this is to unfollow influencers or individuals or media who portray unrealistic body types on a regular basis. Because what you see impacts your self-image so strongly. Beyond that, taking a basic course in something like Photoshop to more clearly understand how pictures in your media landscape are altered, and watching TV shows and influencers where diverse body types are portrayed can help you to round out your collectivist view and ultimately help you feel more comfortable in your own skin. If you want more science about body image, check out our newest episode of our podcast Side Note, where we dive even deeper into the science. Or you can check out our latest science videos, which we'll link on the screen here. And subscribe for more weekly science videos.
I do think that we're under tremendous amounts of pressure these days to conform to what we believe an idealized body form is. I think that the media has a great part to play in this.
Some of the influence comes from their peers, but I think most of it's from like media, like magazines or television.
You're not sitting there thinking, oh, that's airbrush, oh, that's fixed. You're not thinking about that. You're thinking about, why don't I look that way? And it does make you feel really bad.
You see the way that they look, they have the muscles, they're popular, and you're just like, maybe I need to look like that.
I always want to get bigger, more cut, more defined, everything. I'm never usually satisfied with my body image. They think they can't do it naturally, so they use steroids. And you really don't think about the future, you think of the present, it won't mess up my life, and really it will.
It becomes an obsession. You're never good enough for yourself.
And then here is G.I. Joe from the 1990s. Bicep is up to 16 inches or so, full six-pack of abs, even got serratus muscles visible on the side.
I think men have for a few decades now tried to redefine their masculinity with certain attributes, not being able to rely on the more traditional ways of a kind of protector or moneymaker to rely on those things anymore. So I think that the media has given us a new way that we can actually define our masculinity and our role as males in society. So I think it's affecting all of us.
There's a misconception that only women suffer from body image issues, and in fact it's become acceptable that women suffer from body image issues. But in my practice as a family therapist, I've seen many, many men who come in with body image issues, and it starts from such a young age, from adolescence. Over the last few decades, you can see how the media has really taken over, and they're the ones who really dictate what the ideal male image should look like. And we can see this even with the evolution of actors and athletes, and even bodybuilding is becoming this huge phenomenon in our society, and it's very, very alarming.
Where the doors are rolling all day long, where the stairs are leading doors to dawn, where the windows are breathing in the light, where the rooms are
For me, this story begins about 15 years ago when I was a hospice doctor at the University of Chicago. And I was taking care of people who were dying and their families in the south side of Chicago. And I was observing what happened to people and their families over the course of their terminal illness. And in my lab, I was studying the widower effect, which is a very old idea in the social sciences going back 150 years, known as dying of a broken heart. So when I die, my wife's risk of death can double, for instance, in the first year. And I had gone to take care of one particular patient, a woman who was dying of dementia. And in this case, unlike this couple, she was being cared for by her daughter. And the daughter was exhausted from caring for her mother. And the daughter's husband, he also was sick from his wife's exhaustion. And I was driving home one day, and I get a phone call from the husband's friend, calling me because he was depressed about what was happening to his friend. So here I get this call from this random guy that's having an experience that's being influenced by people at some social distance. And so I suddenly realized two very simple things. First, the widowhood effect was not restricted to husbands and wives. And second, it was not restricted to pairs of people. And I started to see the world in a whole new way, like pairs of people connected to each other. And then I realized that these individuals would be connected into foursomes with other pairs of people nearby. And that in fact, these people were embedded in other sorts of relationships, marriage and spousal and friendship and other sorts of ties. And that in fact, these connections were vast. And that we were all embedded in this broad set of connections with each other. So I started to see the world in a completely new way, and I became obsessed with this. I became obsessed with how it might be that we're embedded in these social networks and how they affect our lives. So social networks are these intricate things of beauty. And they're so elaborate and so complex and so ubiquitous, in fact, that one has to ask what purpose they serve. Why are we embedded in social networks? I mean, how do they form? How do they operate? And how do they affect us? And so my first topic with respect to this was not death, but obesity. And it had become trendy to speak about the obesity epidemic. And along with my collaborator, James Fowler, we began to wonder whether obesity really was epidemic, and could it spread from person to person like the 4 people I discussed earlier. So this is a slide of some of our initial results. It's 2,200 people in the year 2000. Every dot is a person. We make the dot size proportional to people's body size. So bigger dots are bigger people. And in addition, if your body size, if your BMI, your body mass index is above 30, if you're clinically obese, we also color the dots yellow. So if you look at this image right away, you might be able to see that there are clusters of obese and non-obese people in the image. But the visual complexity is still very high. It's not obvious exactly what's going on. In addition, some questions are immediately raised. How much clustering is there? Is there more clustering than would be due to chance alone? How big are the clusters? How far do they reach? And most importantly, what causes the clusters? So we did some mathematics to study the size of these clusters. This here shows on the y-axis the increase in the probability that a person is obese given that a social contact of theirs is obese. And on the x-axis, the degrees of separation between the 2 people. And on the far left, you see the purple line. It says that if your friends are obese, your risk of obesity is 45% higher. And the next bar over, the orange line, says if your friends' friends are obese, your risk of obesity is 25% higher. And then the next line over says if your friends' someone you probably don't even know is obese, your risk of obesity is 10% higher. And it's only when you get to your friends' that there's no longer a relationship between that person's body size and your own body size. Well, what might be causing this clustering? There are at least 3 possibilities. One possibility is that as I gain weight, it causes you to gain weight, a kind of induction, a kind of spread from person to person. Another possibility, very obvious, is homophily, or birds of a feather flock together. Here, I form my tie to you because you and I share a similar body size. And the last possibility is what is known as confounding, because it confounds our ability to figure out what's going on. And here the idea is not that my weight gain is causing your weight gain, nor that I preferentially form a tie with you because you and I share the same body size, but rather that we share a common exposure to something like a health club that makes us both lose weight at the same time. And when we studied these data, we found evidence for all of these things, including for induction. And we found that if your friend becomes obese, it increases your risk of obesity by about 57% in the same given time period. And there can be many mechanisms for this effect. One possibility is that your friends say to you something like, they adopt a behavior that spreads to you, like they say, let's go have muffins and beer, which is a terrible combination. But you adopt that combination, and then you start gaining weight like them. And another more subtle possibility is that they start gaining weight and it changes your ideas of what an acceptable body size is. And here what's spreading from person to person is not a behavior, but rather a norm. An idea is spreading. Now, headline writers had a field day with our studies. I think the headline in the New York Times was, are you packing it on? Blame your fat friends. What was interesting to us is the European headline writers had a different take. They said, are your friends gaining weight? Perhaps you are to blame. And we thought this was a very interesting comment on America and, kind of self-serving, not my responsibility kind of phenomenon. Now, I want to be very clear. We do not think our work should or could justify prejudice against people of one or another body size at all. Now, our next question was, could we actually visualize this spread? Was weight gain in one person actually spreading to weight gain in another person? And this is complicated because we needed to take into account the fact that the network structure, the architecture of the ties, was changing across time. And in addition, because obesity is not a unicentric epidemic. There's not like a patient zero of the obesity epidemic. We find that guy, there was a spread of obesity out from him. It's a multicentric epidemic. Lots of people are doing things at the same time. And I'm about to show you a 30-second video animation that took me 5 years, me and James, 5 years of our lives to do. And so again, every dot is a person. Every tie between them is a relationship. And we're going to put this into motion now, taking daily cuts through the network for about 30 years. The dot sizes are going to grow. You're going to see a sea of yellow take over. You're going to see people be born and die. Dots will appear and disappear. Ties will form and break. Marriages will and divorces. Friendings and defriendings. A lot of complexity. A lot is happening just in these 30-year period that includes the obesity epidemic. And by the end, you're going to see clusters of obese and non-obese individuals within the network. Now, when I looked at this, it changed the way I see things. Because this network that's changing across time has a memory. It moves. Things flow within it. It has a kind of consistency. People can die, but it doesn't die. It still persists. And it has a kind of resilience that allows it to persist across time. And so I came to see these kinds of social networks as living things that we could put under a kind of microscope and study and analyze and understand. And we used a variety of techniques to do this, and we started exploring all kinds of other phenomena. So we looked at smoking and drinking behavior and voting behavior and divorce, which can spread, and altruism. And eventually we became interested in emotions. Now, when we have emotions, we show them. why do we show our emotions? I mean, there would be an advantage to experiencing our emotions inside, anger or happiness. But we don't just experience them, we show them. And not only do we show them, but others can read them. And not only can they read them, but they copy them. There's emotional contagion that takes place in human populations. And so this function of emotions suggests that in addition to any other purpose they serve, they're a kind of primitive form of communication. And that in fact, if we really want to understand human emotions, we need to think about them in this way. Now, we're accustomed to thinking about emotions in this way in simple, sort of brief periods of time. So for example, I was giving this talk recently in New York City, and I said, like how when you're on the subway and the other person across the subway car smiles at you, and you just instinctively smile back. And they looked at me and said, we don't do that in New York City. And I said, everywhere else in the world, that's normal human behavior. And so there's a very instinctive way in which we briefly transmit emotions to each other. And in fact, emotional contagion can be broader still, like we can have punctuated expressions of anger, as in riots. The question that we wanted to ask was, could emotions spread in a more sustained way than riots across time and involve large numbers of people, not just these pair of individuals smiling at each other in the subway car? Maybe there's a kind of below-the-surface quiet riot that animates us all the time. Maybe there are emotional stampedes that ripple through human social networks. Maybe, in fact, emotions have a collective existence, not just an individual existence. And this is one of the first images we made to study this phenomenon. Again, a social network, but now we color the people yellow if they're happy and blue if they're sad, and green in between. And if you look at this image, you can right away see clusters of happy and unhappy people, again spreading to 3 degrees of separation. And you might form the intuition that the unhappy people occupy a different structural location within the network. So there's a middle and an edge to this network, and the unhappy people seem to be located at the edges. So to invoke another metaphor, if you imagine social networks as a kind of vast fabric of humanity, I'm connected to you and you to her, on out endlessly into the distance. This fabric is actually like an old-fashioned American quilt, and it has patches on it, happy and unhappy patches. And whether you become happy or not depends in part on whether you occupy a happy patch. So this work with emotions, which are so fundamental, then got us to thinking about maybe the fundamental causes of human social networks are somehow encoded in our genes. Because human social networks, whenever they are mapped, always kind of look like this, the picture of the network. But they never look like this. Why do they not look like this? Why don't we form human social networks that look like a regular lattice? Well, the striking patterns of human social networks, their ubiquity and their apparent purpose, beg questions about whether we evolved to have human social networks in the first place and whether we evolved to form networks with a particular structure. And so notice, first of all, so to understand this, though, we need to dissect network structure a little bit first. And notice that every person in this network has exactly the same structural location as every other person. But that's not the case with real networks. So for example, here's a real network of college students at an elite Northeastern university. And now I'm highlighting a few dots. And if you look here at the dots, compare node B in the upper left to node D in the far right. And B has 4 friends coming out from him, and D has 6 friends coming out from him. And so those 2 individuals have different numbers of friends. That's very obvious. We all know that. But certain other aspects of social network structure are not so obvious. Compare node B in the upper left to node A in the lower left. And now those people both have 4 friends. But A's friends all know each other, and B's friends do not. So the friend of a friend of A's is back again a friend of A's. Whereas the friend of a friend of B's is not a friend of B's, is farther away in the network. This is known as transitivity in networks. And finally, compare nodes C and D. C and D both have 6 friends. If you talk to them, they would say, and you said, what is your social life like? They would say, I've got 6 friends. That's my social experience. But now we, with a bird's eye view looking at this network, can see that they occupy very different social worlds. And I can cultivate that intuition in you by just asking you, who would you rather be if a deadly germ was spreading through the network? Would you rather be C or D? You'd rather be D, on the edge of the network. And now who would you rather be if a juicy piece of gossip, not about you, was spreading through the network? Now you would rather be C. So different structural locations have different implications for your life. And in fact, when we did some experiments looking at this, what we found is that 46% of the variation in how many friends you have is explained by your genes. And this is not surprising. We know some people are born shy and some are born gregarious. That's obvious. But we also found some non-obvious things. For instance, 47% in the variation in whether your friends know each other is attributable to your genes. Whether your friends know each other has not just to do with their genes, but with yours. And we think the reason for this is that some people like to introduce their friends to each other, you know who you are, and others of you keep them apart and don't introduce their friends to each other. And so some people knit together the networks around them, creating a kind of dense web of ties in which they're comfortably embedded. And finally, we even found that 30% of the variation in whether or not people are in the middle or on the edge of the network can also be attributed to their genes. So whether you find yourself in the middle or on the edge is also partially heritable. Now, what is the point of this? How does this help us understand? How does this help us figure out some of the problems that are affecting us these days? Well, the argument I'd like to make is that networks have value. They are a kind of social capital. new properties emerge because of our embeddedness in social networks. And these properties inhere in the structure of the networks, not just in the individuals within them. So think about these two common objects. They're both made of carbon. And yet one of them has carbon atoms in it that are arranged in one particular way on the left, and you get graphite, which is soft and dark. But if you take the same carbon atoms and interconnect them a different way, you get diamond, which is clear and hard. And those properties of softness and hardness and darkness and clearness do not reside in the carbon atoms. They reside in the interconnections between the carbon atoms, or at least arise because of the interconnections between the carbon atoms. So similarly, the pattern of connections among people confers upon people, the groups of people, different properties. It is the ties between people that makes the whole greater than the sum of its parts. And so it is not just what's happening to these people, whether they're losing weight or gaining weight or becoming rich or becoming poor or becoming happy or not becoming happy that affects us. It's also the actual architecture of the ties around us. Our experience of the world depends on the actual structure of the networks in which we're residing and on all the kinds of things that ripple and flow through the network. Now, the reason I think that this is the case is that human beings assemble themselves and form a kind of superorganism. Now, superorganism is a collection of individuals which show or evince behaviors or phenomena that are not reducible to the study of individuals and must be understood by reference to and by studying the collective. Like, for example, a hive of bees that's finding a new nesting site, or a flock of birds that's evading a predator, or a flock of birds that's able to pool their wisdom and navigate and find a tiny speck of an island in the middle of the Pacific, or a pack of wolves that's able to bring down larger prey. Superorganisms have properties that cannot be understood just by studying the individuals. I think understanding social networks and how they form and operate can help us understand not just health and emotions, but all kinds of other phenomena, like crime and warfare, and economic phenomena, like bank runs and market crashes, and the adoption of innovation and the spread of product adoption. Now, look at this. I think we form social networks because the benefits of a connected life outweigh the costs. If I was always violent towards you, or gave you misinformation, or made you sad, or infected you with deadly germs, you would cut the ties to me and the network would disintegrate. So the spread of good and valuable things is required to sustain and nourish social networks. Similarly, social networks are required for the spread of good and valuable things, like love and kindness and happiness and altruism and ideas. I think, in fact, that if we realized how valuable social networks are, we'd spend a lot more time nourishing them and sustaining them. Because I think social networks are fundamentally related to goodness. And what I think the world needs now is more connections. Thank you.